It was my 31st birthday. I stood at the head of the conference table in my Chicago firm, surrounded by my team. They were holding champagne flutes. I was waiting for a toast. Instead, the door swung open. A man in a cheap, rumpled suit walked past my assistant. He didn't apologize. He didn't smile. He just dropped a thick blue folder onto the glass surface of the table. The sound was heavy, like a judge's gavel. He turned and walked out without a word. I looked down. The label was typed in bold, black letters. Petition for emergency guardianship. Petitioner, Brenda Hayes. Reason, severe substance instability. The room went silent. My phone buzzed against the table. I glanced at the screen. It was a text from my mother. We are doing this because we love you. I looked up at my employees. They were staring, confused, waiting for me to react. But I didn't blink. This wasn't a birthday gift. It was a declaration of war. Before I tell you what I found in that folder, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from right now. I want to know who is standing with me today. I picked up the folder and walked into the executive conference room. The lock clicked shut with a satisfying weight. I sat down and opened the file. Panic is just structural instability, and I didn't have the luxury of collapsing. I read every word. The petition claimed I was erratic, paranoid, addicted to opioids. I turned the page to the evidence. Photos of my kitchen trash can filled with empty orange pill bottles. I zoomed in on the labels, oxycodone. I don't take painkillers. I take multivitamins. I recognized the angle of the photo immediately. My brother, Dustin, had been at my apartment 3 days ago. He hadn't come to visit. He had come to stage a crime scene. A cold calm washed over me. This wasn't an intervention. It was a heist. They wanted control of my accounts, my firm, my life. I reached for my phone. I didn't call my mother to beg. I didn't call my father to ask why. I dialed the one number they were terrified of. Cynthia, my estranged aunt, the forensic accountant who hunted hidden assets for sport. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp. Lauren? I stared at the Chicago skyline, gray and steel against the glass. They pulled the trigger, Cynthia, I said. I want to audit them. I want to know where every single cent went for the last 30 years. She didn't hesitate. Send me the files. I hung up. My mother was calling now. I watched the screen light up, then go dark. I wasn't going to answer. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was an architect, and I was about to dismantle their entire lives, brick by brick. I sat in the silence of the conference room, the blue folder still open in front of me. In architecture, a collapse is rarely sudden. It is almost always the result of a stress fracture that went ignored for years until the load became too heavy to bear. For my family, that fracture didn't happen today. It happened exactly 3 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday. My brother, Dustin, had called me. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about my work. He asked for $30,000. He called it seed capital for a revolutionary day trading algorithm he was developing. But I knew the truth. I had seen the gambling apps on his phone during Christmas dinner. I had seen the desperation in his eyes that looked less like ambition and more like drowning. For 10 years, I had been the load-bearing wall of this family. I paid off my father's business loans that were actually disguised vacations to Cabo. I covered the mortgage on the sprawling suburban estate they insisted on keeping to impress neighbors who didn't even like them. I funded Dustin's 3 failed startups, his car payments, and his rent. I was their safety net, woven from my own exhaustion. But 3 weeks ago, for the first time in my life, I said no. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just said, I'm done funding the illusion, Dustin. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, suffocating. Then came the rage. He called me selfish. He said I thought I was better than them because I had a view of the lake and a degree on the wall. He told me I had forgotten where I came from. When I hung up, I felt a strange mixture of terror and lightness. I kept wondering, why did it take me 31 years to say that one syllable word? Why was it so hard? In architecture school, we learned about stress loads, but in psychology, there is a concept called learned helplessness. It is best explained by the story of the baby elephant. When an elephant is young and small, trainers chain one of its legs to a heavy stake driven deep into the ground. The baby pulls and pulls, straining against the iron, but it is too weak to break the chain or uproot the stake. Eventually, it stops trying. It learns that struggle is useless. Here is the tragedy. When that elephant grows into a 5-ton giant capable of ripping a tree out of the earth with its trunk, the trainers still use the same small chain and the same small stake. The elephant could snap it with a single casual step, but it doesn't, because in its mind, the chain is still unbreakable. The physical reality has changed, but the psychological limitation remains. For 31 years, my family had kept me chained to the stake of their approval. They trained me to believe that my only value was what I could provide for them. They needed me to believe I was weak, so I wouldn't realize I was the one holding up the roof over their heads. They needed the elephant to stay small. But 3 weeks ago, I took that step. I snapped the chain. I looked down at the legal papers. This conservatorship petition, this claim of mental instability, this wasn't an act of love. It was their panic. The elephant had walked away, and the trainers were scrambling to build a stronger cage. They weren't trying to save me. They were trying to reshackle their asset. I looked down at my hands resting on the cool glass table. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. I wasn't going back to the stake. I was going to pull the whole circus down. The escalation didn't happen in court. It happened at my front door. 2 nights after the petition was served, I was in my apartment, sitting on the floor, surrounded by the forensic accounting files Cynthia had encrypted and sent over. It was 11 p.m. The city outside was quiet, a hum of distant traffic and wind against the glass. Then, a heavy, authoritarian pounding shook my door. I checked the security camera feed on my phone. 2 uniformed officers, hands resting near their belts. Not a social call. My heart hammered against my ribs, a primal spike of adrenaline, but I forced my breathing to slow. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. I opened the door. "Lauren Hayes?" the older officer asked. He looked tired, his eyes scanning the space behind me. "We received a 911 call from a Brenda Hayes. She stated, you sent a text message threatening self-harm and that you may be in possession of illegal narcotics." I stared at them. The hallway behind them was filling with faces. My neighbors, the couple from 4B who always smiled in the elevator, the old man from 4F. They were peeking out, watching the police interrogate the quiet architect in 4C. I felt the heat rise in my neck. Not shame, but a cold, hard fury. My mother hadn't just lied. She had weaponized the police to humiliate me in my own sanctuary. She wanted to create a public record of instability. I didn't send any text. I said, my voice calm, factual, slicing through the tension. My mother has filed a frivolous lawsuit against me to gain access to my finances. This is harassment. You are welcome to come in. I stepped aside. I watched as their heavy black boots tracked mud onto my pristine white wool rug. I watched them open my bathroom cabinets, scanning for the imaginary oxycodone. They found nothing but organic cotton pads, expensive face cream, and a label maker. My apartment was a model of minimalist perfection. No chaos, no drugs, no instability, just the quiet order of a woman who had built a life far away from the people trying to destroy it. The officers looked uncomfortable. The younger one holstered his flashlight. "Sorry for the disturbance, ma'am. We have to follow protocol." "I understand," I said. "Please log in your report that the premises were secure and the subject was calm." As the door clicked shut, I didn't collapse. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. I knew my brother was probably parked down there, waiting to see me dragged out in handcuffs. That was the moment the last structural beam of affection collapsed. I picked up my phone and called Marcus, my lawyer. "They want to play dirty," I said. "Let's go to the war room." The next morning, I sat in Cynthia's office. The air smelled of stale coffee and ozone. The walls were covered in timelines and bank statements. Cynthia looked like a shark smelling blood in the water. She pointed to a highlighted column on the screen. "Your father's family trust," she said. "The one he claims pays for the estate? It's bleeding money. But look at the inflow." I squinted at the numbers. The trust had been established in 1995. The monthly deposits didn't come from my father's investments. They came from an estate lawyer representing a man named Arthur Reeves. "Who is Arthur Reeves?" I asked. Cynthia slid a photograph across the mahogany table. It was an obituary clipping from 3 decades ago. The man in the photo had my eyes, my jawline, my exact hairline. "He was a client of your father's old firm," Cynthia said quietly. "He died in 95. Wealthy, no heirs, except, apparently, one." The air in the room seemed to vanish. I looked from the photo to Cynthia, then to Marcus. The pieces were clicking together like a steel trap. "We need a DNA test," Marcus said. "Expedited." I nodded, staring at the face of a stranger who looked more like me than the man I'd called Dad for 30 years. The conflict had shifted. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a criminal investigation, and I was the lead detective. 48 hours before the hearing, the results arrived. I was standing in the center of my living room, phone in one hand, a glass of water in the other. An email notification pinged from the lab. Subject: DNA analysis, paternity exclusion. I opened it. The probability of Todd Hayes being my biological father was 0. 0. I felt a strange sense of vertigo, like the floor had dropped out from under me. But then came the second email from Cynthia. Subject: the Arthur Reeves Trust, deed analysis. I opened the attachment. It was a forensic breakdown of the last 30 years. My mother had an affair with Arthur Reeves. When he died, he left a massive trust fund for his illegitimate child, me. $1.2 million. My parents, Todd and Brenda, had forged my birth certificate to list Todd as the father. That forgery allowed them to appoint themselves as trustees of my money. For 30 years, they hadn't just been living off my salary. They had been draining my inheritance, the vacations, the cars, Dustin's gambling debts. It was all paid for, but as I scrolled to the bottom of the PDF, I saw the twist that made my blood run cold. The suburban estate, the house where I grew up, the house where they currently lived, the house where they sat right now, planning how to lock me away in a conservatorship. They hadn't bought it. The trust had bought it. The deed was listed under the Arthur Reeves Testamentary Trust for the benefit of the minor child. I dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor, shards of crystal scattering like diamonds. I didn't flinch at the noise. I stared at the words on the screen. Legally, the house wasn't theirs. The trust had purchased it as an asset for the beneficiary. I was the beneficiary. I didn't just own the truth. I owned the roof over their heads. I picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Draft the paperwork," I said. "For the defense?" he asked. "No," I said. "For the eviction. They wanted to declare me incompetent to manage my own assets. I was about to show them exactly how competent I was. The tenants were about to meet the landlord. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old wood, a scent that usually reminded me of libraries and safety. Today, it smelled like a trap. My mother, Brenda, sat at the plaintiff's table, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief she had bought specifically for this performance. She was wearing a soft pastel cardigan, the uniform of a worried, loving mother. Beside her, my father, Todd, stared at his hands, playing the part of the weary patriarch. And Dustin was wearing a suit that didn't fit, trying to look like a concerned brother instead of a man who had gambled away his own future. Their lawyer, a man named Carson, who charged by the hour and spoke in bold, confident lies, stood up. "Your Honor," Carson said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, "we take no pleasure in this. But Lauren Hayes is a danger to herself. The police report shows a history of erratic behavior. The text messages," he held up the fabricated screenshots, show a woman spiraling into substance abuse, her family simply wants to step in to protect her assets until she is well. I sat next to Marcus and Cynthia. I didn't fidget. I didn't object. I watched them build their wall of lies brick by brick. In architecture, we let the structure settle before we test its integrity. The judge, a stern woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, looked at me. Miss Hayes, does your counsel wish to respond to the allegations of substance instability? Marcus stood up. He didn't pick up a notepad. He picked up a single file, the DNA results, and the deed. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice calm, filling the room. We do not object to the concept of asset protection. In fact, we agree that the assets in question are in grave danger, but not from my client. He walked to the bench and handed the file to the judge. Then he turned and placed a copy in front of Carson. We are submitting a motion to dismiss based on lack of standing, Marcus continued. And we are submitting evidence of massive fiduciary fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement committed by the petitioners against the respondent. The judge opened the file. Her eyes widened. She flipped the page, then another. The silence in the room stretched tight, like a cable about to snap. Mr. Carson, the judge said, her voice dropping an octave. Is your client aware that DNA evidence proves Todd Hayes is not the biological father of the respondent, and that the family trust they are petitioning to control was actually established by the biological father, Arthur Reeves, for the sole benefit of Lauren Hayes? Brenda stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The pastel cardigan performance vanished. That is a lie! We raised her! We are her family! She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Real tears this time. Tears of terror. Lauren, how could you? We fed you. We clothed you. We sacrificed everything to raise you. I looked at her. For years, that guilt would have crushed me. After all we did for you. But today, I felt nothing but the cold precision of a final inspection. Cynthia leaned forward, her voice cutting through Brenda's sobbing like a scalpel. Let's be clear, Brenda, Cynthia said. You didn't raise a child. You managed an asset. You took a trust fund meant for her education and used it to buy your cars and fund your husband's hobbies. That isn't parenting. That is embezzlement. Brenda gaped, her mouth opening and closing. It was an investment in the family. We are a family. That is the sunk cost fallacy, Cynthia replied, addressing the room but looking straight at my mother. You believe that because you spent years housing her, using her own money, I might add, that you are entitled to a return on investment forever. But human beings aren't stocks, Brenda, and you don't get to claim ownership over a life you stole. The judge slammed her gavel. Order! Sit down, Mrs. Hayes. The judge looked at the deed in her hand. This document shows the residence at 4402 Oakwood Drive was purchased by the Arthur Reeves Trust. Miss Hayes is the sole beneficiary. Legally, the petitioners are residing in a property owned by the respondent. I stood up then. I picked up the single piece of paper I had brought with me. I didn't look at the judge. I walked over to the plaintiff's table. I looked down at Dustin, who was pale, sweating in his ill-fitting suit. I looked at my father, who wouldn't meet my eyes. And finally, I looked at Brenda. I slid the paper across the table. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was an official notice from the sheriff's department. This is a notice to quit, I said softly. You are trespassing on my property. You have 72 hours to vacate. If you are not out by Friday at noon, the sheriff will remove you forcibly. You can't do this, Dustin whispered. Where are we supposed to go? I don't know, I said, but I suggest you start looking for a smaller stake, because this elephant is gone. I turned my back on them and walked out. Behind me, I heard the judge's gavel bang down, dismissing the case with prejudice. But I didn't stop. The air outside the courthouse was cold and biting, and for the first time in 31 years, it tasted like oxygen. The demolition crew arrived at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. The sky was a sharp, brilliant blue. The kind that hurts your eyes if you look up for too long. I stood on the sidewalk across the street from the house at 4402 Oakwood Drive. My neighbors, the people Brenda had spent 30 years trying to impress, watched from behind their curtains. They whispered about the police cars that had arrived 3 days earlier to escort my family off the property. They whispered about the fraud charges filed by the district attorney against Todd and Brenda Hayes. They whispered about Dustin, who had been escorted out, screaming about his rights, clutching a bag of designer clothes he hadn't paid for. But I wasn't listening to the whispers. I was listening to the engine of the excavator. My lawyer, Marcus, stood beside me. You know, he said, adjusting his glasses, you could have sold it. The market value is over $800,000. I know, I said. I watched the metal claw of the machine rise into the air. But you can't renovate a house with a rotten foundation, Marcus. You have to scrape the lot clean. The claw swung down. It smashed through the roof of the master bedroom, the room where Brenda used to sit and calculate how much of my trust fund she could siphon off for her next vacation. The sound of wood snapping and glass shattering was louder than I expected. It sounded like a bone breaking. For a second, I felt a phantom ache in my chest. That was the room where I had cried when I didn't get into the private school they promised me. That was the kitchen where I had learned to cook so I could feed Dustin when Brenda was too stressed to make dinner. That was the living room where I had written the checks that kept them afloat. But as the chimney crumbled into a cloud of red dust, the ache vanished. I looked down at the paperwork in my hand. It was a court order granting a legal name change. I traced the letters with my thumb. Lauren Reeves. It wasn't just a name. It was a correction, an architectural revision. For 31 years, I had defined my worth by how much weight I could carry. I thought being strong meant enduring. I thought love was measured by how much you were willing to suffer to keep a roof over someone else's head. I was a load-bearing column in a structure that was designed to crush me. But I realized something in that courtroom. You are not obligated to be the foundation for people who treat you like a floor mat. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm, especially when they are the ones holding the matches. I watched the last wall of the house collapse. The dust settled, revealing the empty lot behind it. It looked small, manageable, ready for something new. I turned to Marcus. Let's go. Where to? He asked. To the firm, I said. I have a new project to design. I walked away without looking back. I wasn't a survivor anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was the architect. And for the first time in my life, the blueprint belonged entirely to me. Script completed. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself from the ground up, type blueprint in the comments. And if you want the full audio of the courtroom scene, share this video so I know you're ready for part 2.